Good evening. How's everybody doing? Good to be learning with you on a Monday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Paula in the Great Northwest, Carla in Brazil, Bill from snowy, icy mid-Missouri, where I'm hunkered down and planning to hibernate till next week. See how silly we are in California? We don't know that it snows in the South. Of course it snows in the South. Guy in Ohio, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella's in the house. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Dana Vandersip in memory of her mom, Sandra Weintraub, who passed away in March. She was an intelligent, elegant woman, a fierce advocate for women's rights and her family, and my sisters and I always tried to be just like her. What a beautiful dedication, Dana. May your mom's memory, Sandra Weintraub's memory, always be for a blessing. May her neshama, her soul, have a great aliyah, a great elevation in the world of souls. We say amen, and may you and all your loved ones, your sisters and all your families, be showered in blessings. We say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Today is the 8th. And that reminds me, so we didn't have class yesterday. I was at a Chabad fundraiser out in the desert. So we'll get caught up this week. In fact, we're even doing a little bit more than a page today. And we'll be back on schedule. But next Sunday, we'll start a short hiatus. Well, not so short, 9 days. Nina and I are going to Israel to visit our son in yeshiva there. And so we won't have AT Daily while we're away, starting next Sunday. But what I'm going to try to do, if it's permitted, is to broadcast live maybe a few times from the classes in Israel, assuming they're taught in English and it's appropriate and it's permitted. So if possible, you guys can be a fly on a wall with us as we attend yeshiva for a few days in the Old City in Jerusalem. Okay, let's get into it. That starts next Sunday. So we're on, today's Monday. We have a whole week of classes to do before that happens. Okay, so our daf today is page 66 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 7. And we were discussing on Saturday night this idea that if an item that a thief stole is transformed, like its very nature changes while it's in his possession, so then it's as if, legally speaking, he's acquired it. Meaning that the thing he stole, because it's been transformed, like if a lamb matures into a ram, so the lamb no longer exists. And at that point, it's as if the thing that he stole has been destroyed. So it's not like he acquires it and he can keep it, he got away with it. It just means that the restitution that he needs to make is now going to be monetary rather than returning the item, since the item no longer exists. Now, one of the reasons for that, as we'll be discussing tonight, is that if, for example, a thief stole a beam, right, a thick beam of wood, and then he built it into his house, and later, he's feeling penitent. He wants to make an atonement, and he wants to make it right. So the beam still exists. It's part of his house. It has not been transformed. The beam is right there, but in order for him to actually return the beam, he would have to dismantle the house, and the motivation to make it right would, be very much diminished in such a case. So the sages have this ordinance for the penitent that we'll be discussing, where now that the beam is built into his house, and you might say it's transformed in that sense, he can repay the one he stole it from with money, right? With money rather than the actual object. So this idea that something that is transformed while it's in your possession means that the thief acquires it is a legal distinction that is important to understand what the various ramifications of that are. So let's get into it. So Rabbah said, the principle that a change in a stolen item causes the thief to acquire it is written in the Torah. And we learned it in the Mishna as well. It is written in the Torah, Leviticus 5:23, then it shall be, if he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore the item that he robbed. And what is the meaning when the verse states the seemingly superfluous phrase that he robbed? We already know we're talking about a thief, and we're talking about restoring the item, so why do we again say the item that he robbed? And this serves to teach you that if the item is the same as it was when he stole it, then he must return the stolen item itself. But if it is not the same as it was then, he is required to pay only money, while the stolen item remains in his keep. We learned this law in a Mishna as well, as it is taught on page 93b of this volume, in the case of one who robs another of wood and fashions it into vessels, or one who robs another of wool and fashions it into garments. So he pays the robbery victim according to the value of the goods at the time of the robbery, and he keeps the altered materials for himself. I mean, imagine if a painter, a famous painter, early in his career, whatever, was hard up, and he stole some canvas and some paint, right? And it was worth $20. Later he becomes famous, right? And that canvas and paint is worth millions of dollars. So what does he need to return? $20 worth of canvas and paint, or millions of dollars worth of art? Now, you can see how this question could play out in certain circumstances. Alternatively, another Mishnah can serve as the source for this principle in Tractate Chulin 135a. If one did not manage to give the first of the sheared wool of his sheep to a priest, right, because one who shears his sheep, like that is part of his income for the year, the shearing the wool off the sheep, and you have to tithe that, just as you have to tithe produce from your field. So of the shearing, so the first 2%, right, is going to be maaser tithing for the priest, like teruma. So if one did not manage to give the first of the sheared wool of his sheep to a priest until after he dyed it, right, he changed its color, he dyed it. So you should see Deuteronomy 18:4. For this, he is exempt from giving it to the priest. Right? The first of the shearing is no longer the first of the shearing. Once it's been dyed, it's been transformed. And this Mishnah indicates that an item that has undergone a change is no longer considered to be the same item as it had been. So apparently a physical change in a stolen item causes the thief to acquire it. Now Rabbah continues to discuss the ways in which a thief acquires ownership of a stolen item. So with regard to the owner's despair, right? This is a word yi'ush that comes up a lot in Jewish law. Despair means that the owner either has literally despaired, I'm never going to find it, right? He's given up on ever recovering the item that was either lost or stolen. Now, once there's yi'ush, once there is despair on the part of the owner, he doesn't expect to recover it. So then that item that is out in the world is considered ownerless, and it's finders keepers, right? And this would be the case, for example, when somebody loses, a few dollar bills on a city street. There's no identifying mark. It's not in a wallet that's identifiable. It's not held together with a money clip that's identifiable. So how would he ever expect that somebody would find, his dollar bills, his few dollar bills that he dropped on the street, and then find him and return it to him? That's a situation, kind of a classic case of Yush, that he has despaired of ever getting it back. So if you find money on the street and there's no way to give it back to its owner, it's just not going to happen, it's not possible, then it's owner's keepers. You should tithe what you find for sure. And if there's any chance of returning it because it was lost in a certain location, and maybe it's possible, to advertise if it was lost in front of a building where people come and go and it was likely one of them, that's a different situation, right? So the elements of despair, legal despair, right, when we're talking about despair of recovering an item, we'll be discussing at greater length another time. Here, we're talking not about when do we say despair has happened, but what are the consequences of despair. And again, we're not talking about emotional despair of, ever achieving your dreams kind of thing. This is very much a legal notion with regard to a possession. So, Rabbah continues to discuss the ways in which a thief acquires ownership of a stolen item. So, with regard to the owner's despair over ever recovering the stolen item, the sages say that this too causes the thief to acquire the stolen item. However, we do not know if this law applies by Torah law or by rabbinic law. So, Rabbah elaborates on the two possibilities he has just mentioned. If it applies by Torah law, and generally remember that there are important differences. If something is a law that's explicitly written in the Torah, or not explicit, but in a way that the sages identify it as clearly written in the Torah, even through their exegetical principles, then it's a Torah law, right? And that's also known as doraisa, right? So if it's a written Torah law, in the case of doubt, suffek, we're going to be machmir, stringent. Whereas if a law is a rabbinic ordinance, right? Generally rabbinic ordinances, rabbinic statutes were passed for the purpose of making a fence around the Torah to protect people from coming too close to violating a Torah law. So in terms of rabbinic laws, they're the law just as much as a Torah law is the halacha. But when it's a rabbinic law, in cases of doubt, suffek, we're going to be lenient, right? We're going to be lenient. So that's the big difference. In case of doubt of a rabbinic law, leniency. In case of doubt of a Torah law, stringency. And that's one of the differences. Okay, so Rabbah talks about this. So if it applies by Torah law, right, that if a thief steals something and he does it in such a way that the owner despairs of ever recovering it, so if then we say that the thief acquires it as a legal matter. Now, he is still liable to be punished for stealing, and he has to make restitution. It's just that the restitution is going to be by money rather than necessarily the item. So if it applies by Torah law, this is just as it is with regard to one who finds a lost item, right? In terms of lost items, if the owner has despaired, then it becomes ownerless. Now, is it not the case with regard to one who finds a lost item, that once the owner of the item despairs of recovering it, before the item came into the finder's possession, the finder acquires it and may keep it for himself? And the same principle applies to this as well. Once the owner of the item despairs of recovering it, the thief acquires it for himself and need no longer return the item itself. He's still liable to pay for it, but he need not return the item itself if the owner despaired. So apparently then, the despair of the owner causes the thief to acquire the stolen item. That's one possibility. Or perhaps the case of a stolen item is not comparable to the case of a lost item, as it is only with regard to a lost item that the owner's despair enables the finder to acquire the item, because the item came into his possession in a permitted manner. He found it. He didn't do anything wrong. But in this case of the thief, since the item came into his possession in a prohibited manner, because he stole it, this case cannot be derived from the laws of the lost item. So if so, the ruling that despair affects acquisition in a case of theft applies not by Torah law, but rather by rabbinic law. Now, why would this halacha, this law, have been instituted by rabbinic law? As the sages said, that a thief should acquire the stolen item in this manner. Why? Due to an ordinance instituted for the penitent, right? To help thieves have the possibility of making an atonement. So to encourage thieves to repent and to repay their victims, the sages instituted that they need not return the stolen item after the owner despairs of recovering it. Rather, they can reimburse the owner for the monetary value of the item. And remember that if a thief comes forward without having been caught and exposed by two witnesses, then he only has to make restitution. He might have to make restitution plus a fifth, but he doesn't have to make the double payment, the 200% payment, unless he's caught, right? So it's a further inducement to atone and make it right. So, and Rav Yosef says, despair on the part of the owner over the possibility of recovering his item does not cause the thief to acquire that item at all. And this is the law, even by rabbinic law, right? So Rav Yosef is completely saying to Rabbah, whoa, you've got this wrong. Now Rav Yosef is going to explain. So he says, he raises his objection to Rabbah from a Mishnah on page 96b in this volume, that if one robbed another person of leavened bread, and Passover elapsed in the meantime, right? Leavened bread is chametz, right? And that's something that a Jew is not allowed to own during Passover, right? So if the thief steals leavened bread, and we're talking about a Jewish thief here, so he steals leavened bread from another Jew. Okay, now he has it, and Passover comes. Now, since he's a Jew, he is not allowed to own chametz during Passover. And certainly the owner who had the leavened bread stolen, I think he's definitely going to put it out of his mind of ever recovering, especially once Passover comes. So if one robbed another of leavened bread and then Passover elapsed in the meantime, so that deriving benefit from that chametz, from that leavened bread, is prohibited, so the robber may nonetheless return the worthless bread to the owner and say to him, now we're on page 66b, okay, that which is yours is before you. I took it, I gave it back. And no compensation is required. So Rav Yosef states his objection. But in this case, once the time of the prohibition of leavened bread arrives, the owner certainly despairs of recovering his now worthless bread. And if it enters your mind to say that the owner's despair causes the robber to acquire the stolen item, well then, why can he say to him, that which is yours is before you? He should be required to pay the owner full-fledged money, what the leavened bread was worth at the time that the thief stole it. So why would the sages say that he can actually return this now worthless bread, now worthless because Passover elapsed during that time, and no matter who owned it, that ownership was nullified because a Jew is not allowed to own leavened bread once Passover arrives. So if you're allowed to return this bread that you stole, it must be that it remained the owner's in some way, and it did not become the thieves. So Rava said to Rav Yosef in response, when I say that the thief acquires the stolen item upon the owner's despair of recovery, it is when this owner despairs and that thief wants to acquire the item. So in this case, one of them despairs, but the other one does not wish to acquire. So you can't use the example of one who stole leavened bread and then Passover happened as a counterexample, because the owner doesn't want it and neither does the thief once Passover arrives. So Abaye raised an objection to Rabbah from a Baraisa. So the verse, if his offering is a burnt offering of the herd, Leviticus 1:3, this indicates that one's offering must be his offering, but not an animal stolen from another. Right? So if you want to make an offering when the temple is standing for whatever is a sin offering, a guilt offering, a peace offering, and a thanksgiving offering, etc., what animal can you offer in the temple as a sacrifice? An animal that you own, right? You have to have honestly either purchased it or raised it or whatever. You can't steal an animal and then offer that to God as an offering. Of course, you're not going to create an atonement or any joy in God at the offering that you've made with something that you stole. So it has to be yours. Okay, so it has to be his offering, but not an animal that was stolen from another. So what are the circumstances of the case referred to by the Baraisa? If we say it is dealing with a stolen animal that the robber consecrates and sacrifice before the owner's despair of recovery, why do I need a verse to teach this? It is obvious that it is disqualified, as one cannot even consecrate an animal that does not belong to him. So rather, is it not referring to one who seeks to consecrate and sacrifice an animal that he stole after the owner has despaired of recovering it? And yet, the Baraisa teaches that the animal cannot be consecrated by the thief. So conclude from the Baraisa that the owner's despair of recovering a stolen item does not cause the thief to acquire it, as if it belonged to him, he would be able to consecrate and sacrifice it. Rava said to Abaye, in order to refute this proof that Abaye just brought, and according to your reasoning, consider that which is taught in a Baraisa. It is written with regard to a zav, that's a man who experiences a gonorrhea-like discharge, quote, and whoever touches his bedding shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be impure until the evening. That's Leviticus 15:5. And this indicates that bedding on which a zav lies can become ritually impure, tameh, and impart that tumah, that ritual impurity, only if it is his bedding, but not if it is stolen bedding. So what are the circumstances of the case discussed in this Baraisa? If we say that he robbed another of wool and made it into bedding, is there anyone who says that a physical change that results from an action performed to a stolen item does not cause the thief to acquire it? We've already concluded that if the item is transformed, the thief does acquire it. So rather, what have you to say? The Baraisa must be speaking of a case in which the Zav robbed another person of bedding, not wool that he turned into bedding, but bedding that is already bedding. So too, the previous Baraisa is dealing with one who robbed another of an offering, already consecrated. And the reason this animal does not atone for the thief is that a consecrated animal cannot be stolen and become the thief's property, as it belongs to the temple treasury, wherever it is located. So Abaye raised an objection to Rav Yosef from a Mishna in Tractate Kelim, 26:8. So with regard to hides, right, animal skins belonging to a homeowner, one's thought renders them susceptible to contracting ritual impurity. When we say that somebody's thought renders them susceptible, what we're saying is any kind of a vessel or utensil is not susceptible to ritual impurity until it is completed. While it's being manufactured, it cannot become tameh, cannot become ritually impure. When it is completed, it is susceptible to tumah. So when is an article that is manufactured by some kind of a craftsman, when is it complete, right? It might be that for a sloppy craftsman, once he's made a cup that looks like a cup, that's a cup. Now it's susceptible to tumah. But for a very fine artistic craftsman, that, sloppy cup, he would never, sell that or gift that or present that to anyone in any way, shape, or form as a utensil that he had made. That is utterly unfinished in his eyes. He would need to polish it, shape it, or sand it, buff it, do all kinds of stuff before he would consider it done. And even so, let's say that he was planning to give it a final buffing to really make it shiny. And then he realized, I've been overshining these things. Maybe they shouldn't be quite so shiny, and then people don't want to use them as cups. So he says, I'm not going to, do the ultra buffing on that silver cup. In fact, it's done now. So when he thinks to himself, it's done, and he's the craftsman, that's when it becomes done. And that's why we say that thought can render something susceptible to tumah, because it's the thought of the craftsman when he decides it's finished, that is when it becomes susceptible to tumah. So Abaye raised an objection to Rav Yosef from a Mishnah. With regard to hides belonging to a homeowner, one's thought renders them susceptible to contracting ritual impurity. Hides and leather are susceptible to contracting impurity only if they are in a finished state. So if a private individual uses a piece of hide or leather for a certain purpose, for example, as a cot or as a tabletop, and he decides that this will be its fixed purpose, then it is considered a finished product, and it is susceptible to contracting impurity. But with regard to hides that belong to a leather worker, thought does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity. Since this individual sells leather to others, when he uses a piece of leather for a household purpose and decides that this will be its fixed purpose, this is not considered a finished state, as he is likely to change his mind and sell the leather to one who will process it further and put it to a different use. Now the Mishnah continues, if the hides are those of a thief who has stolen them from another, the thief's thought renders them susceptible to ritual impurity. If they are those of a robber, his thought does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity because he is not considered the owner of the hide. What's the difference? We're talking about the difference between a thief and a robber, right? A thief sneaks in and a robber confronts the owner. That's the difference. So the difference is that unlike the case of a thief who steals items stealthily, the identity of a robber who takes the item openly is known to the owner, and the owner harbors hope of finding the robber and getting the item back. Consequently, he does not despair of recovering his property. So Rabbi Shimon says that the matters are reversed. Actually, in the case of a robber, the robber's thought renders them susceptible to ritual impurity. If the hides are those of a thief, thought does not render them susceptible to ritual impurity because the owners have not despaired of recovering them and the thief has not acquired the hide. And Rabbi Shimon's reasoning is that a robber who seizes items brazenly is a more difficult criminal to apprehend and bring to justice than a thief, right? Like, especially think in the ancient world where, you had long stretches of road that there weren't so many police around to help you out. The army wasn't going to come help you out. So, a sneaky thief, if you caught him, you could scare him and get him to give you your stuff back. But a robber who brazenly takes from people, right, because he's so confident in his might and weapon craft and, maybe he's got a bunch of bad guys riding with him, and he it's just very difficult to get anything back from him because he's the authority on that stretch of road. And although the two Tanaim of the Mishnah disagree as to which situation involves an owner's despair of recovery, whether robbery or theft, in any event, and this is why we brought down this teaching, in any event, one can conclude from this Mishnah that the despair of the owner does cause the thief or the robber to acquire the item, as otherwise the perpetrator's thoughts about the hide would have no effect on its status with regard to ritual impurity. So Rav Yosef said to Abaye in response, with what are we dealing here in the Mishnah? It is a case where the thief or the robber trimmed the leather by cutting it. Although trimming a piece of leather is not a sufficient change to constitute an act of acquisition by itself, it is effective in conjunction with the owner's despair. So Rabba bar Rav Chanan objects to this answer. But is it not the case that they taught this Mishnah here with regard to a leather tabletop known as an itzbah? And a leather tabletop does not require trimming, either due to the fact that its edges are not seen or because it is merely ornamental. Since it does not require trimming, this action should not be considered an act of acquisition at all. And as we learned in the previous Mishnah, Kalim 26:7, wherever there is no work lacking for an item to be considered finished, at least by some, one's thought renders it susceptible to ritual impurity. When there is still some work lacking for the item to be considered finished, thought does not render it susceptible to ritual impurity, except for the case of a leather tabletop. Although further work is required to smooth out the edges, one's thought can render it susceptible to impurity because people do not care if this leather tabletop has uneven edges. It is with regard to this case of a tabletop that the Mishnah distinguishes between a homeowner and a leather worker. Therefore, Rav Yosef's explanation is rejected. So the Gemara suggests a different answer. Rather, Rava said that this matter was a difficulty posed by Rabba to Rav Yosef for 22 years, and it was not resolved until Rav Yosef sat as the head of the yeshiva and resolved it in the following manner. Now, before I tell you Rav Yosef's resolution of this matter, let's understand this little story of Rabba and Rav Yosef. We've talked about this before, but it's worth reminding. So the Gemara in Tractate Horayos, page 14a, relates that Rav Yosef was extremely knowledgeable. He retained everything that he had ever learned. That's why it was tragic later when he kind of got ill and lost his memory. But for most of his life, Rav Yosef was known as the one with the perfect recall. Every Mishnah, every Gemara, every law, every teaching that he'd ever heard, he could repeat. Whereas Rabba had extraordinary analytical skills. He was the one that could derive new laws, that could understand how the law in a complex case was derived from a seeming contradiction in one area of the Torah that it looks like a contradiction but doesn't contradict. You know, that beautiful, amazing analytical reasoning that was so necessary in deriving laws and understanding derivations from earlier generations. Right? And you can see how these are two great Torah luminaries, but they bring a different skill to the table. One recalls everything he ever learned, and one has the amazing analytical skills. Now, which one of these qualities is more important? If you have to prioritize one over the other, which of these qualities is more important for a sage who's going to be, let's say, a Rosh Yeshiva, the head of a rabbinic academy? Rav Yosef remembered everything. Rabba had extraordinary analytical skills. Since it was unclear which of them was more suitable to serve as the head of the yeshiva in Pumbedisa, right, in the Babylonian Jewish community, so the issue was referred to the Amoraim, the sages in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. They sent back word that they preferred the more knowledgeable scholar. They wanted somebody who could preserve all the teachings from the earlier generations. That's of greater utility to everybody. There are many geniuses, but not everyone can recall everything. And over time, in an oral tradition, if you don't have people that have perfect recall, obviously laws are going to be lost, the tradition's going to be muddied. You need people with that tremendous recall. So they said you should appoint Rav Yosef to be the head of the academy. But Rav Yosef refused the mantle of leadership. He himself deferred to Rabba, who remained the head of the yeshiva for 22 years. And after he died, then Rav Yosef became the head of the yeshiva, and he was the head of the yeshiva for 2 years. By then he was very old. Okay, so during those 22 years, right, that Rav Yosef deferred to Rabba. So even though he disagreed with him, he said, okay, well, I'm just the second in command here at the yeshiva. Rabba is in charge, so his view of the law stands. But when Rabba finally passed away, then Rav Yosef sat as the head of the yeshiva, and he resolved this dilemma. A change in the name of an item, representing a change in status, is similar to a physical change that is brought about by an action. And what is the reason that a physical change through an action causes the thief to acquire the item? It is because the stolen items were initially just wood, and now they are vessels. And the same can be said for a change in name as well. Initially they called it a hide, and now they call it a tabletop. So the Gemara asks a question with regard to changes in name. But what about the case of a beam? where there is a change in the name, as initially when it was stolen, it was called a beam, and now after it has been placed in a building, it is called a joist. And yet we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Gittin 55a, with regard to a stolen beam that a robber had built into a large building, the court ruled that the owner should receive its value in money rather than demand that the robber demolish the house in order to return the beam itself. Why? Because of an ordinance instituted for the penitent, i.e. to encourage robbers to admit their crime and reimburse the owner for the stolen item. And the Mishnah indicates that the only reason the robber does not have to return the beam itself is because of this ordinance instituted for the penitent. Now we're on page 67a, getting a little bit of a jump on the next stop. So one can infer, but if it were not for this decree, the beam would have to be returned to the owner as is, notwithstanding its change in name, right? The decree was a policy measure instituted for the penitent, but the actual halacha is that if you stole a beam and the beam still exists, you have to return the beam if it requires tearing down the house. And Rav Yosef said this is not a genuine change in name, as a beam retains its name even after it is inserted into a building, as it is taught in a baraisa with regard to two obscure items. The verse states, "And there were narrow windows and palm trees on the one side and on the other side. On the sides of the porch there were also the tzalot of the house and the ubim." Ubim, right? This is a Hebrew word from Ezekiel 41:26. So tzalot of the house, these are the casings, hamaltetin, and the ubim, these are the beams, hamerishot. And this shows that a beam can retain its name even after it has been built into a house. So Rabbi Zera said a different answer. With regard to a change in name, a change in which the item can revert to its original state is not considered enough of a change for the thief to acquire the stolen item. Since the joist can be removed and revert to being called a beam, it is not considered a true change of name. So the Gemara asks, and is a change in name in which the item does not revert to its original state really considered a change? But there is the case of a water duct, where it was initially called a log, and now it is called a duct. And it is taught in a baraisa, a duct that one hollowed out and afterward attached to the ground or to a building invalidates a mikvah. Through the water it channels to the bath. The water in a mikvah must be gathered directly from rain or a stream, not drawn with vessels. If one hollowed out a log and used it to channel water into the bath, this is considered drawn water as he used a vessel. By contrast, if one first attached it and afterward hollowed it out, it does not invalidate the mikvah. Before the log was hollowed out, it was already attached and considered to be part of the ground, and therefore the act of hollowing it out does not turn it into a vessel, because a vessel that is attached to the ground is not a vessel. So the Gemara states its question, and if you say that a change in this, it's more complicated than that, but in this context. So the Gemara states its question, and if you say that a change in name is considered a matter of significance, i.e. it is considered a real change in the item, then even if one attached the log first and afterward hollowed it out, the mikvah should also be invalid. Since hollowing out the log leads to a change in name, it should be considered a new vessel at that point. So the Gemara answers, the law that drawn water may not be used for a mikvah is different, as that itself applies by rabbinic law. And consequently, the sages were lenient in this case. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, then even in the first clause where the log was hollowed out before being attached, it should be permitted as well. Since we're saying it's by rabbinic law that you can't use this drawn water, and in this case we're not sure, it's a case of doubt. In a rabbinic law, we should be lenient. So the Gemara answers, there is a difference between the two cases. There, in the first clause, the log had the status of a vessel while it was still detached. Here, in the second case, it did not have the status of a vessel while it was detached, but only after it became attached to the ground, and then it became a vessel, and therefore the sages were lenient. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara raises an objection against Rav Yosef's opinion against Rav Yosef's opinion that the owner's despair that he will recover his stolen items does not affect acquisition for the thief from a baraisa. With regard to a thief, a robber, and one who forces people to sell him items against their will, their consecration of the items that they obtained in these manners is a valid consecration. And the teruma that they separate from the produce that they obtain in these manners is valid teruma. And the tithes that they separate from those and the teruma that they separate from the produce that they obtain in these manners is valid teruma, and the tithes that they separate from those foods are valid tithes. So consecrations, terumot, and tithes must be performed by the owner of the item in question. Since there was no physical change in these items, this shows that the thief is considered the new owner merely by virtue of the owner's despair of recovery. And the sages say, in answer to this question, in those cases involving consecrations, terumos, and tithes, there is a change in name of the stolen item, as initially the stolen food was called untithed produce, i.e. produce from which teruma and tithes have not been separated. And now it is called teruma or tithe. With regard to consecration, it was initially called non-sacred property, and now it is called consecrated property. A lot more to the law than that, but as we see, one of the very important elements in discussing whether when a thief steals something, can we say that legally he has acquired it, and then one of the consequences being that he can pay money when he makes restitution to the victim of the theft. One of the elements of whether that's possible or not is whether the victim of the theft has despaired of ever getting the actual item returned to him or not. Okay. Here we go. Joseph, we may have gone over similar things, but what if someone loses a young animal and then finds it? Nobody has claimed it or declared ownership. Then the animal changes, but the owner later wants it back. Hold on. Someone loses a young animal, and then he finds it. Nobody has claimed or declared ownership, and then the animal changes, but the owner later wants it back. So you're saying that somebody loses the animal and somebody else finds it, right? And when he finds it, he finds a grown animal. Or he finds it and it becomes a grown animal while it's in his possession. But the owner of the lost item never despaired of losing it. He always hoped that his animal would wander home. That's a classic case of not despairing. So does the fact, right, so I don't know that we've talked about the animal maturing in the case of theft. Did we talk about it in case of loss? Right, when you are obligated to return something, but it becomes a mature animal while in your care, the owner never despaired of losing it. Are you obligated to return it? There we have another issue, right? That the one who's caring for the lost item is entitled to reimbursement for all the money that he paid to take care of the animal while it was in his care. I don't know if he gets compensated for his time, but he definitely gets compensated for money that he actually spent to take care of the lost animal. So one of the interesting questions is, can we ever say that despair is truly a legal concept, so that even if the actual owner never despaired of having it recovered, we would say, yeah, but as a legal matter, by definition, when this thing is gone and you had no reasonable expectation of ever recovering it, it doesn't matter that you always hoped you'd get it back. We might still say that despair happened. When we actually get to the discussion of despair later in our journey, we'll talk more about that. Sharon, so a cat of mine got out and was missing for weeks before he reappeared. I certainly despaired of ever finding him. So, 1, is he still mine or did he become ownerless? And 2, if someone else had found him, who would have had the claim on him? Same question, right? Same question we just discussed. In this case, you did despair. So you can say that the animal became ownerless and whoever found it. But then we have the interesting question of, well, the animal would rather be with you. So even though the people who found it were very nice, eventually the animal comes back to you. Then what happens? I mean, these are interesting questions. I do not know the answer offhand, but very good questions. And that's what I've got for us today. So with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday, at the regular time.